Welcome to Scriptura's layer-by-layer overview of Psalm 18. The breaker waves of death surrounded me, and the torrents of no return began to overwhelm me, and the cords of the world of the dead entangled me. But I cried out to the Lord, who heard me cry and delivered me. The earth quivered and quaked, and the mountain's foundations began to shake as he descended to aid me. My God is my rock, my shield, and the horn of my deliverance, my fortified tower, my refuge, my deliverer, who delivers me from violence. In Psalm 18, the psalmist goes through a difficult time, feeling completely hopeless because he thinks he is going to die violently. But he finishes feeling victorious as every last enemy of the psalmist falls defeated at his feet. It is as if his feelings start in a deep pit and end on a high mountain. In the end, he exclaims excitedly, "The Lord lives, and my rock is blessed. The God who rescues me is exalted." The phrase, "the Lord, my strength and deliverer," summarizes what the psalmist needs as he faces such a difficult time, as well as what will solve his crisis. David desperately needed someone to make him strong and to rescue him. The Lord provided what he needed. He made David strong and rescued him, delivering him from all his enemies. The Lord responded to David's love by being loyal to his covenant promises and rescuing him from everything that was threatening him, just when he most needed God to help him. Psalm 18 has 5 sections that build around 2 battle scenes. One battle scene is spiritual, between God and a symbolic, powerful enemy, the waters of death. The other battle is between David and human enemies. The first section, verses 2 to 7, we have summarized as David's distress. David's distress will cause him to cry out. But before he does that, there is an introduction that helps us interpret the situation David is facing. David lists 10 titles for the Lord. Each of these titles describes a different way in which the Lord is ready to help and to rescue his servant David. As the section unfolds, it becomes clear that the Lord fully deserves each of these descriptive titles. The Lord is indeed David's rock, his shield, and his deliverer. David needs that help because he is in a very dangerous situation. Death itself is about to defeat him. Using common ancient imagery, the psalm speaks of death as an enemy, represented by deep waters. This enemy threatens to drown David in the waves and in the rushing, violent streams of water called torrents. David feels overwhelmed and in great distress, so he cries out to the Lord to help him. In the second section, verses 8 to 20, the Lord delivers David. Just before the waters of death can take David's life, the Lord appears and fights the threatening waters. The Lord comes down to rescue David, his servant, in a rush of violent activity. Smoke, coals, and fiery lightning announce that he has arrived. The earth quivers and quakes as he comes. The foundations of the mountains shake and tremble as he shows how angry he is. The enemy waters, which were too powerful and deadly for David, now run away when the Lord arrives. The Lord rebukes them, and the ocean floor submits and obeys him. The Lord has rescued David from death. David then reflects on what happened, awe at how God showed his anger with such violent activity, and with relief that such a powerful rescuer came to help him. Next, in verses 21 to 30, the Lord vindicates David. Here, the psalm explains the reason the Lord rescued David. The Lord changed the situation so powerfully because that is what he does for people faithful to him. He acts faithfully to them. He rewards people based on what they do. He saves the humble, but he humbles the prideful. The psalm illustrates how God's justice works, especially in the life of David. David has been innocent and has kept the Lord's ways. Since David has been faithful to the God, he could then expect God to be faithful to him, helping him when he needed God to act. Instead of feeling helpless to face enemies that are too powerful for him, David can feel confident. With God on his side, he knows that nothing can stop him. With God on his side, David can thoroughly defeat an army or climb a wall. David delights in what God always does. He responds to people's loyalty by showing how loyal he is too, and making sure they stay well, in the sense of a rich peace. When David followed God faithfully, he personally experienced how God behaved this way. In the fourth section, verses 31 to 43, David defeats his enemies. David shifts his perspective on the kind of trouble he faced, and now he describes it not as fighting spiritually with the waters of death, but as fighting physically with human enemies. David had no power to fight in the spiritual battle against the deadly waters, but in this version of the battle, David is bold when he faces a human enemy. God strengthens David and makes him ready to fight with such skill that he could defeat any enemy. The psalm first describes God as a shield, a defensive weapon to protect David. Then, the psalm describes God as offensive weapons, arming David with strength and training his hands for war. The defense and offense come together when God supplies David with the shield of victory. God defends David by making him strong enough to chase and confront his enemies. God has helped David so that David can make every last enemy disappear, falling beneath his feet like the mud of the streets. With God's armor, David is supported, bold, and triumphant. In the final section, verses 44 to 51, David praises the Lord enthusiastically for delivering him from many kinds of trouble. The most common trouble was people's indictments, false accusations in which people accused him of things he did not do. In the historical books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, David was often accused of being disloyal to King Saul. Saul believed the false accusations, and out of jealousy, Saul sought to kill David. On many occasions, God rescued David from Saul. David praises the Lord for rescuing him from all his enemies so many times, and he also praises the Lord for the reason why he delivered him, to make David king over many other nations. The confidence David had gained when God rescued him becomes confidence in all God's promises. Foreigners will submit to me. The God who gives me vengeance will put me in a higher place than those who try to fight against me. With great joy, David praises God for being loyal to his anointed one, himself. David also praises God for promising to be loyal to David's seed. That is, to David's descendants who will reign after him forever. Psalm 18 illustrates what it looks like for the Lord to treat his chosen king in a way that fits with his own character. When David, his anointed one, is in trouble, the Lord takes action. The Lord does not prevent David from getting into trouble, but when enemies threaten David's life, the Lord comes to help. In the psalm, David describes God's help from two perspectives. From one perspective, God rescues David from the waters of death, which is a symbol of a powerful spiritual force. From another perspective, David pictures God giving him weapons so he can defeat his earthly enemies. From the first perspective, the Lord battles death for David. Then, from the second perspective, he gives David what he needs to battle the human forces himself. In the process, David's enemies become the Lord's enemies, and David's battle becomes the Lord's battle. As soon as the Lord steps in to fight for David, David can win against everyone. With God on his side, there is no one who can defeat David in the spiritual world or in the human world. Let's look at the historical background for a moment. The superscription tells us that this psalm is about David thinking about the many times the Lord delivered him from enemies, especially Saul, when Saul was hunting David to take his life. At first, Saul was king over Israel, and David was Saul's servant. But when David became more successful than Saul at fighting Israel's enemies, Saul became jealous. He was afraid that David would overthrow him and become king in his place. People falsely accused David of being disloyal to Saul. For many years, Saul and his men hunted David, trying to kill him. David spent much of his time running away from Saul in the rocky wilderness, where he looked for safe places to hide in various caves and rock formations. The psalm uses many of these images for God. God is like a cleft, a split or hollow area in a mountainside that can protect people. God is like a rock and fortress. These rock formations saved David's life multiple times. He often uses them to describe God as images that recall every time God protected his life when he was in desperate need. Psalm 18 has lots of imagery. The first battle is a spiritual battle between the powerful forces of death and the Lord. In the biblical world, people understood that the world of the dead was a place beneath the earth, beneath mighty waters. In the psalm, the way David describes these mighty waters is very frightening. First, he describes them as breaker waves, which are ocean waves so high and moving so fast that they fold over themselves at their peak, and the water powerfully rushes forward, creating lots of swirling foam. Boats caught in these kinds of waves are broken in pieces. People cannot swim in water that is moving like this. They are crushed and they drown. These waves are so deadly that David describes them as breaker waves of death. Another image he uses is torrents, which are rushing, violent flows of water. These are not just any torrents. They are torrents of no return, torrents that are trying to pull the psalmist down to death, the place from which he can never return to the world of the living. When the breaker waves of death and the torrents of no return threaten David, this is a picture of spiritual forces trying to drown him and send him forever to the world of the dead. David's enemies are not simply human enemies. He describes them as spiritual enemies. They are trying to kill him, just like stormy water threatens to drown a person. When David calls out to the Lord for help, the Lord responds by showing how angry he is with the enemies that threaten David. David describes the Lord with the imagery of erupting volcanoes. The destructive eruption causes the earth to shake, smoke to rise, and fire and coals to burn. Dark clouds and darkness are the background for brilliant light from lightning, which flashes like shining arrows as the Lord rebukes the waters that threaten his servant. When the Lord battles death, David uses storm and battle imagery for the Lord. The Lord thunders and shoots arrows, and the waters run away, revealing the bare ocean floor. After chasing away the threatening waters, the Lord pulls his servant David out of danger, rescuing him and making sure he is completely safe. The second battle is a battle on earth between David and his human enemies. The imagery here shows the Lord giving David armor that both protects him in battle and makes him ready to fight more powerfully. He gives David a shield, he trains his hands and arms, and he makes them strong enough to use a bow of bronze. The result is that David is so powerful he crushes his enemies like the dust on the road. These two battles are also a key poetic feature of how David wrote this psalm. The psalm has two battle scenes, and each scene poetically expresses a central idea. Since David is the Lord's covenant partner, David's battle is also the Lord's battle, and his enemies are also the Lord's enemies. The Lord fights huge spiritual battles against powerful forces, which the psalm shows when the Lord defeats the waters of death. David, the Lord's representative on earth, fights human battles, which the psalm shows when he crushes his enemies like the mud of the streets. This summarizes what David has experienced for decades, that the Lord always rescues him when he is in trouble, and that the Lord rescues him by strengthening him so he can defeat his enemies. David was able to defeat his first enemy, Goliath, when he trusted God to make him strong enough to defeat Goliath with a simple slingshot. He defeated every enemy after him with the same strength. The strength his God, his deliverer, gave him. Now that we are familiar with this background and imagery, we'll proceed through the psalm, section by section.
For the director, by the Lord's servant David, who recited the words of this song to the Lord, when the Lord had rescued him from the palm of all his enemies, and from the hand of Saul. And he said, I shall keep loving you, Lord, my strength. The Lord is my cleft and my fortress and my rescuer. My God is my rock. In him do I seek protection. My shield and the horn of my deliverance. My fortified tower and my refuge. My deliverer who delivers me from violence. I cry out to the Lord, since he is praiseworthy, and I am delivered from my enemies. The breaker waves of death surrounded me, and the torrents of no return began to overwhelm me. The cords of Sheol entangled me. Death's traps rushed upon me. In my distress I cry out to the Lord, and to my God do I cry for help. He hears my cry from his temple, and my cry for help before him comes into his ears.
Psalm 18 has one of the longest superscriptions in the Psalms. Instead of indicating a specific time that led David to write this psalm, the superscription says that David recited the words of this song to the Lord when he had rescued him out of the palm of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. David was running away and hiding from Saul for many years. During this time, he refused to fight Saul because Saul was Israel's first king and God's anointed. But also during this time, there were many other battles that David did fight, whether against the Philistines or wild animals or thieves or roaming groups of people who attacked and stole from David's people. In fact, David was so successful as a fighter that Saul became jealous. All these troubles he describes, which included both the battles David fought and the battles he refused to fight. They're all combined into one symbolic battle here in Psalm 18. The psalmist's goal is to describe how the Lord acts when his people are in danger. That aligns well with the first part of the superscription for the director, which tells us this psalm was for the people to use in the temple for worship. This psalm became a song of praise that people regularly sang to the Lord because he was the one who rescued his servant, David, from all his enemies. Remembering the Lord's actions in worship implied that people believed the Lord would continue to rescue his servants from all their enemies. The final verse makes it clear that the Lord continues to rescue his people when it addresses the Lord as, "You who make the deliverance of his king spectacular and perform acts of loyalty for his anointed one, for David, and for his seed," that is, David's descendants, forever. This psalm remembered and celebrated the Lord being faithful to David and his descendants when they faced enemies. This psalm declared that the Lord would always rescue them. We have summarized the first section with the title David's Distress, but the distress itself is actually the topic for only 2 verses of the 6 in the section. The psalm begins with David firmly declaring, "I shall keep loving you, Lord." Then the psalm gives 10 poetic descriptions of the Lord, which is the same as the number of the 10 commandments. Each poetic description of the Lord comes with the word my, which functions like a poetic drumbeat as the psalmist lists how God treats David, my strength, my cleft, my fortress, my rescuer, my rock, my shield, the horn of my deliverance, my fortified tower, my refuge, my deliverer. These 10 imaginative titles proclaim how God treats his servant. The Lord protects his servant when his servant is in danger. The poetry echoes that message in many ways throughout the psalm. In verses 5 and 6, David is surrounded by the terrifying waves that threaten to drown him. Ironically, within the psalm's poetry, these verses are themselves surrounded by David crying out to the Lord and the Lord answering him to rescue him. The poetry is able to present 2 perspectives at once. On the one hand, David is suffering and full of fear that he's close to death. On the other hand, at the same time, the Lord is the kind of God who would be faithful to deliver his servant from the distress. So there is no need for fear. Both verses 4 and 7 describe habitual actions. That is, they show us how David regularly cries out to the Lord and how the Lord regularly responds. It is as if there are 2 separate voices. One voice is confident as it speaks about how God is faithful and rescues people in verses 2 to 4 and verse 7. The other voice is terrified as it describes the distress in verses 5 and 6. David's enemy in this section is death. Here, the psalm describes death both as deep waters and as a hunter, with ropes to catch its prey, and traps that spring up to catch an animal. In this image, David is the prey, like an animal that has no hope of escaping the traps that the hunter has set for him. Verse 6 leaves David in distress. But verse 7 reminds the reader that the Lord always hears when David cries out for help. He hears from his temple, which means that the Lord, who is seated in his temple, as the ruling king over all the earth, hears him. And because he is king, when one of the people who serves him cries for help, the Lord is responsible to care for his servants. It is a quality of his faithful character that he will always respond.
And the earth quivered and quaked, and the mountains' foundations began to shake, and they trembled, for he had become angry. Smoke went up because of his snarl, and a fire from his mouth began to consume. Coals burned from him, and he bent down the heavens and descended, and a dark smog was beneath his feet. And he mounted a cherub and began to fly, and he flew swiftly upon the wings of the wind. He made darkness his cover. He made darkness his canopy around him, the sieve of water, thick clouds of the skies. Because of the brightness before him, hail and coals of fire passed. And the Lord thundered in the heavens, and the Most High began to raise his voice, and shot his arrows, and dispersed them. And he shot his glittering arrows, and routed them. And then the ocean floor appeared, and the foundations of the world were revealed because of your rebuke, Lord, because of the blast of the wind of your anger. He stretched forth his hand from on high and took me. He pulled me out from many waters. He rescued me from my strong enemy, and he rescued me from those who hate me, for they were too powerful for me. They rushed upon me at the time of my calamity, and the Lord was the one in whom I trusted, and he brought me out into relief. He delivered me, for he is pleased with me.
In the next section, the Lord delivers David. So even though in verse 6, David is still in distress, verse 7 reminds us that the Lord is faithful. And this reminder prepares us for some striking imagery beginning in verse 8. The Lord always hears his servants' cries and always responds to them, which is the reason that the Lord responds so angrily and makes the earth shake so violently in this section. Here, the Lord becomes angry at death, David's opponent, and it is like a mighty volcano that causes the earth around it to shake and tremble. Mountains are the most stable part of the earth, but even the foundations, the very bottoms of the mountains, begin to shake and tremble when the Lord is so violently angry. David describes the Lord's anger like the smoke rising and the lava bursting from a volcano, as if the Lord were growling as he heard about his servant being in danger. The psalmist then speaks of the Lord leaving his temple in heaven like a warrior in his chariot. The ancient Hebrews pictured the Lord as living above a vault, that is, a hard ceiling in the sky. So the psalmist describes the Lord bending down the vault, pulling back the floor of heaven that separated the waters above the earth from the sky, so that he can swoop down to earth to rescue his servant. As the Lord comes, dark smoke from all the fire and coals of his volcano-like anger come down in front of him. His chariot is a cherub, which is a winged creature that brings the Lord into spiritual battle. This divine chariot flies swiftly in every direction like a bird of prey that searches the ground, hunting down those who threaten the Lord's servant. Previously, the psalm described death as a hunter, setting traps for David. Now, the psalm describes how this hunter becomes the prey that the Lord is hunting as the Lord comes to David's rescue. The imagery changes again, this time to describe the Lord as a thunderstorm. In a land where people often suffered because of drought, thunderstorms were the main source of water. Because it was God who sent rain, people thought of God when they saw a thunderstorm. Darkness, in the form of dark rain clouds, covers the Lord as he approaches. The sieve of water is the thick covering of clouds that could either hold back rain or let rain through to water crops. This is an image that reminds people how the Lord has the power to either bring life or bring death. All three images, the volcano, the chariot, and the thunderstorm, come together in verse 13. The dark clouds that cover the chariot announce God's arrival. The brightness before him showed his anger, with hail and coals of fire. God, as a warrior in his chariot, is powerful and angry, and with his thunder he declares that he is coming to attack. This thunder represents the Most High himself raising his voice and shouting a battle cry. All this imagery describes the dramatic entrance of the warrior, the Lord, who came to aid his servant. In verse 15, the Lord attacks. He shoots his arrows, which are the lightning bolts from a thunderstorm. The arrows disperse and rout, that is, completely defeat the enemies, who are represented by the breaker waves, torrents, cords, and traps of death that threatened the psalmist. When the waves and torrents are sent away and defeated, it exposes the ocean floor and reveals the foundations of the world. In effect, the enemy waters had been turned to vapor and disappear. It is as if the fiery arrows turned the water to steam, or as if the blast of the storm winds blew the waters away so they could no longer threaten the psalmist. This image means the Lord has thoroughly defeated the enemy. So now he only has to reach out his hand to David. In verse 17, the scene presents David still surrounded by water, but the waters no longer have any power to hold him back. God reaches out from above the waters that have been defeated and takes hold of David, pulling him up to safety. This is a picture of God rescuing David, his servant, from a strong enemy whom he could not defeat on his own. The description of David's rescue in verses 17 and 18 18 uses many verbs with swift actions. He stretched from on high. He took me. He pulled me from many waters. He rescued me from my strong enemy. The wording describing the rescue makes it seem bold and quick and immediate. God has removed the enemies. And now the strong action words David chooses focus attention on how boldly and quickly God rescued him. After dramatically describing the first battle as a great spiritual fight against the power of death, verses 18 to 20 change the subject to describe what the battle symbolized. David fighting against human enemies. Each time David was in trouble, God rescued him from his strong enemy, from every person who hated him or who rejected him because they were fighting for an enemy army or loyal to a different leader. David needed God to rescue him because he could not rescue himself. His enemies were too powerful for him. David repeats the imagery of the deep waters, now applying it to these human enemies in verse 19. He only mentions them briefly, but they return in the second battle scene in verses 31 to 43. Just like the traps of death in the first battle, they rushed upon me at the time of my calamity. But David knew who would rescue him. The Lord was the one in whom I trusted. Every time David called out, the Lord faithfully answered. Here, speaking of how God brought me out into relief, David uses the image of a wide place, relief, where God brings him. This image of a wide place contrasts with the idea of distress, which in Hebrew is the image of a narrow space that limits movement like a prison or a trap. David starts in distress in a terrifyingly narrow place, but he ends up in relief or in a wide, secure place. The whole episode is summed up as, "He rescued me, for he is pleased with me." God rescued David because God delights in his servant who is faithful. God does not rescue everyone, but only those with whom he is pleased.
The Lord deals well with me according to my righteousness. He repays me according to the cleanliness of my hands. For I have kept the ways of the Lord, and I have not turned from my God towards wicked ways. For all of his rules are before me, and I will not turn his decrees away from me. And I have become blameless before him, and I have kept myself from committing iniquity. And the Lord has repaid me according to my righteousness, according to the cleanliness of my hands before his eyes. With a faithful person, you act faithfully. With a blameless person, you act blamelessly. With one who purifies himself, you act with purity. And with a twisted person, you act wittily. For you save a humble people, and you bring down eyes that look down on others. For you light my lamp, Lord. My God gives light to my darkness. For by you I can rout an army, and by my God I can scale a wall.
In verses 21 to 30, the Lord vindicates David. David makes two main statements. First, the Lord rewards me because I have kept his ways. That is, David is saying that the Lord has been just, and he treated David justly. Second, David says, you save the humble, but you humble the prideful. That is, the Lord is always just toward everyone, not just toward David. This idea connects the first and second halves of the psalm. The Lord has treated David justly, which is an example of the Lord's character and how he treats everyone. The relief David feels in verse 20 leads David to express confidence in verse 21. Of course the Lord delivered me, because the Lord deals well with me according to my righteousness. He repays me according to the cleanliness of my hands. David had to spend some time in great distress before God came to rescue him, but David was certain that the Lord would rescue him, which tells us that David knew God would honor his covenant. He would not fail to keep his part of the promise that bound them together. Verses 21 and 25 repeat according to my righteousness, and according to the cleanliness of my hands. They mark this first half of the section as focusing on David being righteous. Verses 22 and 24 repeat the verb kept, when David says, I have kept the ways of the Lord, and I have kept myself from committing iniquity. These are the two sides to being righteous, doing what the Lord requires and avoiding what the Lord forbids. Hebrew poetry often pairs an affirmative statement and a negative statement to represent being totally committed to God. We see this in verse 23 in the center. For all of his rules are before me, and I will not turn his decrees away from me. This is the central point, the key to righteousness, framed with both sides of being righteous in verses 22 and 24. David is totally committed to the Lord's rules, his decrees, everything the Lord has commanded. Echoing the words at the beginning of the psalm, David says he loves the Lord, which includes loving the ways of the Lord, his decrees, and what God thinks is right for a king, for society, for all of life. David tries to see things from God's perspective and adopts it as his own so he can be God's representative and help his people see things from God's perspective too. This is how David shows he is righteous. How God deals with people can be summed up in one word: justice. Justice is illustrated in verses 26 to 30. In verses 26 and 27, God is the one who pays everyone justly, the faithful with faithfulness, the blameless with blamelessness, the pure with purity. The principle here is like the law of retaliation, which requires that any punishment received fits the crime in both kind and degree. Referring to punishment, it is an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. As a more general principle, God acts faithfully with a faithful person and blamelessly with a blameless person. The twisted person in verse 27 is the one who wants to outwit, trick, or deceive others. The way to give this person what he deserves is for someone else to outwit him, which is why God acts wittily. This is the just response to a person who tries to trick others. Verse 28 describes the kind of justice that God uses to keep his covenants with people. In the book of Psalms, a humble people refers to those who trust the Lord alone, even when they are suffering. The Lord rewards those who have a covenant with him and trust only him by saving them. This explains verses 29 and 30. David being righteous includes being humble. The reward for being righteous is that God saves him. God doesn't simply rescue David from suffering. He provides blessing, life, strength, and a powerful victory. God turns the darkness David experiences into light, which means he provides life and hope and wisdom when David feels close to death, hopeless and defeated. With God, David can defeat a whole army. Not only defeat them, but make the enemy scatter in all directions. He can even climb a high wall. With God, what was impossible becomes possible. David is very excited and emotional as he expresses what a difference it makes when God comes down to fight for him.
God, his way is perfect. The sayings of the Lord are true. He is a shield to all those who take refuge in him. For who is God besides the Lord? And who is a rock besides our God? The God who arms me with strength and makes my endeavor secure. He makes my feet like those of a deer's, and he causes me to stand upon my heights. He trains my hands for war, and he strengthens my arms with a bow of bronze. And you give me the shield of your victory, and your right hand supports me, and your help makes me great. You enlarged my steps underneath me, and my ankles did not falter. I chased my enemies, and I overtook them, and I would not relent until their destruction. I violently beat them, so that they could not stand. They fell beneath my feet. And thus you armed me with strength for war. You make those who rise up against me kneel underneath me, and you have made my enemies retreat from me. And as for those who hate me, I wipe them out. They cry out for help, and there is no rescuer. They cry out for help to the Lord, and he has not answered them. And I crush them like dust on the road. I beat them like the mud of the streets.
One of the most striking features of this psalm is how God rescues David in two ways. First, God rescues David from the waters of death when the Lord personally defeats the waters. Second, God makes David strong enough to defeat his human enemies. There are two ways to understand these battles. The first is that there could be two separate battles. One where the Lord fights the invisible enemies, and one where David fights the visible enemies. The second way to understand this is that these two images refer to the same battle. The Lord fights the spiritual side of the battle, while David fights the physical side. together. The two images show us that David's enemies are the Lord's enemies, and David's battle is the Lord's battle because he has a covenant with the Lord. Verses 31 and 32 might tell us how people commonly prepared for battle in ancient Israel. They were called what God was like because remembering his character made them confident. They asked themselves how their God compared to the gods of other nations. Who is God besides the Lord? The implied answer, of course, is nobody. There is no God who can compare with the Lord. There is no other God who is a rock, who shelters and protects his people like the Lord does. Verses 33 and 40 both describe God as the one who arms me with strength. Because God is more powerful and more reliable than anyone else, when he makes a person strong, the effect is very great. He makes his people as quick, as agile, and as graceful as a deer. Deer thrive, even in places where it is difficult to live, like mountains and cliffs, where it is hard to find safe places to stand. Having feet like a deer means standing stable and secure, even in difficult or dangerous situations. The heights in verse 34 is another name for battlefields. So when God causes me to stand upon my heights, it means God helps David to stand, even when those around him have fallen down. Like the deer who are stable and secure where other animals are not, David can still stand where other warriors cannot. Verse 35 changes the topic from how God strengthens David's feet to how he strengthens David's hands and arms. God trains him to go to war skillfully. Specifically, God trained David to use powerful weapons that were hard to master and not everyone could use well. Verses 33 to 35 describe how God prepares David before the battle. Verses 36 and 37 describe what God does during the battle. He gives him the shield of victory. This is a strange image. God protects David like a shield by making him victorious. At a time when David was in a very dangerous situation, God didn't simply rescue him. God went much further than David expected. He gave him a great victory when David says, "Your right hand supports me." He shows he understands completely that God both loves him enough and is powerful enough to rescue him. God's right hand stands for God's might. He can powerfully act to save whomever he wants to save. God chooses to support David. When he does so, God helps make David great. David described the beginning of the attack when his enemies rushed at him in verse 19. In that verse, he simply said, "The Lord was the one in whom I trusted." He didn't tell about the moment when the Lord defeated his enemies. He does not focus on his victory as the most exciting part. Instead, he focuses on the Lord's character and how the Lord vindicates David's character. The important part for David is that God is who he is. God defeating his enemies is just an illustration, not the main point. After the enemy loses the battle, the enemy begins to run away. God prepared David to chase his enemy after the battle too. "You enlarged my steps underneath me, and my ankles did not falter." When God enlarged his steps, it means he helped David run faster. Yet, even when David was running very fast, he did not stumble or trip. God enabled him to run faster and safely to enable him to totally defeat the enemy. David didn't just chase the enemies who ran away. Because God made him so fast, he caught up with them, one by one. He destroyed his enemies. He did not stop fighting or turn back until they were all dead. The imagery turns bloody as David cries out in victory, "I violently beat them, and they could not stand. They fell beneath my feet." The intense violence in the imagery of the Psalms matches the intense anger God felt at David's enemies. Since David is God's representative on earth, David feels angry in the same way. This language of destruction and violently beating means David's enemies were God's enemies. God's enemies deserve to die, and David's task here is to be God's representative and to punish them. The certain way of showing a battle was over in the ancient world was when the winner put his foot on top of the necks of the defeated enemies. The image, "They fell beneath my feet," therefore means that David has completely conquered the enemies. They have not run away, so they will be able to fight another day. They have fallen to the ground, and David can show he is the winner. David pursuing his enemies was the main topic of this section. The remaining verses repeat what he said before. The only change is that now David has fully experienced victory. David has shown that the Lord armed him with strength for war. We can see that David's enemies, those who rebelled against him, now submit to him. They kneel in front of him, which shows they are ready to submit to him and obey him. These many images of victory, falling at David's feet and kneeling in submission, show that the text is poetry filled with figurative language. It does not represent a single historical battle, but rather an imaginary battle that symbolizes all David's fighting. Sometimes kings were under his feet, and sometimes they were kneeling. But the final message is, they surrendered, and David was the victor. Verses 40 to 43 repeat many of the words in verses 31 to 35, confirming that David won so decisively and completely because God armed David with strength. The images of David wiping out the enemies, or the enemies crying out for help, but nobody rescuing or answering them, are horrible. But they confirm that central point. David's enemies are the Lord's enemies, and that is why the Lord will strengthen David so that he is able to destroy them. Whatever they did to become the Lord's enemies means they deserve to be completely destroyed. Their just punishment is to be crushed under David's feet like the dust on the road, and to be trampled like the mud on the streets. There is dust on the road because all the plants and other obstacles have been either removed to make the road or killed because of being stepped on over and over again. People do not think about the mud of the streets. The mud cannot fight back against the people who step on it. David's enemies will be defeated so badly that they will not be able to respond in any way or remember them at all. Nobody will come to help them, and they will not be able to respond. They will be completely defeated. As David has experienced many times, when God will show up to defeat his enemies is often uncertain, but it is absolutely certain that God will defeat them eventually.
You will deliver me from people's indictments. You will make me head of nations. A people I do not know will serve me. As soon as they hear rumors of me, they will show obedience to me. Foreigners will submit to me. Foreigners will lose heart and tremble in their fortresses. The Lord lives, and my rock is blessed, and the God of my rescue is exalted. God who gives me vengeance and subdues people underneath me. You who deliver me from my enemies will indeed exalt me over those who rise up against me. You will rescue me from the violent man. Therefore I shall praise you among the nations, Lord, and I shall sing praise to your name. You who makes the deliverance of his king spectacular, who performs acts of loyalty for his anointed one, for David, and for his seed forever.
David was able to win this great battle himself after the Lord had strengthened him. The final section of the psalm rejoices in the relationship between the Lord and the king who represents him. He does not only deliver his king from people who accuse him, but the Lord lifts up his king to be head of nations. A people he does not know, meaning foreign nations, will end up serving him. This psalm describes how intensely God loves and protects the covenant people who serve him. David starts in the deep waters of death, metaphorically strangled by the cords and ropes of death that threaten to tie him up and drown him. But he ends up as a king whom the surrounding nations must follow and obey. As soon as they hear rumors of me, they will show obedience to me. This is David's future. The Lord will lift him up so high that foreign nations will only hear stories about how strong he is, and they will immediately give up the idea of fighting him, and they will obey him. Foreigners will lose heart. They will not even attempt to fight back when David comes. Foreign nations will wither, just like a plant dies when there isn't enough sunlight. They will not have the strength to resist David. They will come out of their fortresses trembling and afraid when David is angry. When David was in trouble, the Lord became angry, and the mountains and deep waters that symbolized his enemies trembled in fear. The Lord rescued him, so that now, when David is angry, his enemies will also tremble in fear. The Lord's support will make David so powerful that he will be able to defeat every enemy. This final section, like the others, repeats words and phrases that help give it structure. In verses 44 and 49, God is the one who delivers David from his enemies and the accusations his enemies make. When God delivers David, David takes vengeance on his enemies. Foreign nations follow and obey him in response. In verses 44 to 48, there are multiple ways of expressing how foreign nations submit to his authority. The center of this structure is verse 47. The Lord lives, and my rock is blessed, and the God of my rescue is exalted. We could understand this as the psalmist expressing a series of wishes and desires for the Lord's character to be known by all. Long live the Lord! Blessed be my rock! May the God who rescues me be exalted. This is passionate praise. David is committed to the Lord with his whole heart, and he also praises the Lord with his whole heart. The Lord made David victorious, and he deserves all the praise. Verses 48 and 49 finish the frame of this small section of verses 44 to 49 with the additional images of the God who causes people to submit. God delivers David from all his enemies and even lifts him up over those who rebel against him. God rescues David even from the violent man. This final phrase, the violent man, may refer to King Saul, who hunted David for so many years. He was the enemy mentioned by name in the superscription. The last verses echo the first verse of the psalm. In verse 2, David said, I shall keep loving you, Lord, my deliverer, who delivers me from violence. Here, in verses 50 to 51, he writes, I shall praise you, Lord, you who make the deliverance of his king spectacular. When David loves and praises the Lord, he shows that he is fully committed to him. That means David is keeping his part of the covenant. The Lord keeps his part when he delivers his covenant partner, the king. People know the Lord is the one who rescues his people in amazing ways, who performs acts of loyalty for his anointed one. The Lord is fully faithful to his covenant. He is loyal in every way. God had a specific covenant with David and his seed or descendants. This covenant lasts forever. The final phrases of this psalm mean the covenant relationship David had is not for David alone, but for his entire dynasty after him. Forever does not mean only as long as David lives. It means as long as any of David's descendants are on the throne. This is the promise from God that Israel would always remember. God would be loyal to David and his descendants forever. The word seed can refer to a single seed or to a collection of seeds. It is possible David is saying the Lord promises covenant loyalty to David and specifically to one unnamed descendant forever. It is ambiguous whether the promise is for David's many descendants or whether it is for one particular descendant. Later in Israel's history, after hundreds of years passed, it looked like the Lord was not going to rescue his people. This encouraged Israel to understand this promise as for a specific but not yet known descendant. They saw it as a promise that God would keep, but nobody knew when. David knew God would certainly help him to be victorious, but he did not know when. The same would be true with the covenant in the future. God's people knew God would certainly be loyal to his covenant with David's descendants, but nobody knew when he would show his loyalty. The psalm ends with David feeling victorious and joyful, but we still sense some of the tension we noticed in the beginning. God will always be faithful to rescue his people, but no one can know exactly when he will finally act. Psalm 18 is dramatic. It describes David in distress, afraid he is going to die, and then the Lord's powerful response, which makes the earth tremble in fear. It describes the Lord's character as one who justly rewards his people based on his covenant, and it describes David's faithfulness. David is faithful because he depends only on the one true God when he is in trouble. He is also faithful because he hunts down and destroys God's enemies when the Lord strengthens him. In the end, David is honored and lifted high. Even foreign nations follow and obey him, and he acts as God's representative, judging and punishing God's enemies. As the superscription said, this is the full story of David's experience, starting from distress and ending with victory, and David feeling confident and joyful. The story of the servant of the Lord has all of these aspects. Some psalms describe only one part of the experience, but Psalm 18 covers many parts, telling the full story of what it is like to be in a covenant relationship with the Lord. That story of God's faithfulness to rescue his king becomes a promise that David's descendants inherit. David wants to leave his descendants this poem so they will always remember God's promises when they experience distress, when they experience justice, and when they experience victory. Then they will also remember the many reasons to enthusiastically praise the God who defeats their enemies and strengthens them. God is always loyal in this way to the Anointed One, David, his covenant partner, and he will also be loyal to any descendant of David who sits on his throne after him. This completes our section-by-section walkthrough of Psalm 18. We'll finish now with a reading of the text that brings everything together.
For the director, by the Lord's servant David, who recited the words of this song to the Lord, when the Lord had rescued him from the palm of all his enemies, and from the hand of Saul. And he said, I shall keep loving you, Lord, my strength. The Lord is my cleft, and my fortress, and my rescuer. My God is my rock, in him do I seek protection. My shield and the horn of my deliverance, my fortified tower and my refuge, my deliverer, who delivers me from violence. I cry out to the Lord, since he is praiseworthy, and I am delivered from my enemies. The breaker waves of death surrounded me, and the torrents of no return began to overwhelm me. The cords of Sheol entangled me. Death's traps rushed upon me. In my distress I cry out to the Lord, and to my God do I cry for help. He hears my cry from his temple, and my cry for help before him comes into his ears. The earth quivered and quaked. The mountains' foundations began to shake, and they trembled, for he had become angry. Smoke went up because of his snarl, and the fire from his mouth began to consume. Coals burned from him, and he bent down the heavens and descended, and a dark smog was beneath his feet. And he mounted a cherub and began to fly, and he flew swiftly upon the wings of the wind. He made darkness his cover. He made darkness his canopy around him, the sieve of water, thick clouds of the skies. Because of the brightness before him, hails and coals of fire passed. And the Lord thundered in the heavens, and the Most High began to raise his voice, and shot his arrows, and dispersed them. And he shot his glittering arrows, and routed them. And then the ocean floor appeared, and the foundations of the world were revealed because of your rebuke, Lord, because of the blast of the wind of your anger. He stretched forth his hand from on high and took me. He pulled me out from many waters. He rescued me from my strong enemy, and he rescued me from those who hate me, for they were too powerful for me. They rushed upon me at the time of my calamity, and the Lord was the one in whom I trusted, and he brought me out into relief. He delivered me, for he is pleased with me. The Lord deals well with me according to my righteousness. He repays me according to the cleanliness of my hands. For I have kept the ways of the Lord, and I have not turned from my God towards wicked ways. For all of his rules are before me, and I will not turn his decrees away from me. And I have become blameless before him, and I have kept myself from committing iniquity. And the Lord has repaid me according to my righteousness, according to the cleanliness of my hands before his eyes. With a faithful person, you act faithfully. With a blameless person, you act blamelessly. With one who purifies himself, you act with purity. And with a twisted person, you act wittily. For you save a humble people, and you bring down eyes that look down on others. For you light my lamp, Lord. My God gives light to my darkness. For by you I can rout an army, and by my God I can scale a wall. God, his way is perfect. The sayings of the Lord are true. He is a shield to all those who take refuge in him. For who is God besides the Lord? And who is a rock besides our God? The God who arms me with strength and makes my endeavor secure. He makes my feet like those of a deer's, and he causes me to stand upon my heights. He trains my hands for war, and he strengthens my arms with a bow of bronze. And you give me the shield of your victory, and your right hand supports me, and your help makes me great. You enlarged my steps underneath me, and my ankles did not falter. I chased my enemies, and I overtook them, and I would not relent until their destruction. I violently beat them, so that they could not stand. They fell beneath my feet. And thus you armed me with strength for war. You make those who rise up against me kneel underneath me. You have made my enemies retreat from me. And as for those who hate me, I wipe them out. They cry out for help, and there is no rescuer. They cry out for help to the Lord, and he has not answered them. And I crush them like the dust on the road, and I beat them like the mud of the streets. You will deliver me from people's indictments. You will make me head of nations. A people I do not know will serve me. As soon as they hear rumors of me, they will show obedience to me. Foreigners will submit to me. Foreigners will lose heart and tremble from their fortresses. The Lord lives, and my rock is blessed, and the God of my rescue is exalted, God who gives me vengeance and subdues peoples underneath me. You who deliver me from my enemies will indeed exalt me over those who rise up against me. You will rescue me from the violent man. Therefore I shall praise you among the nations, Lord, and I shall sing praise to your name, you who makes the deliverance of his king spectacular, and performs acts of loyalty for his anointed one, for David and for his seed forever.